So welcome. I'm your host, Doug Fink. Today we're going to do the PowerShell Pulse. Let's kick it off. So today we have Clayton Tiger on. He's a 15-year veteran. Loves tech, so he's in the right place. And he'll be up first to talk about, I don't have his title up here. Also, what is the actual name of his presentation, but he'll show you what that is. It's about Excel and M365. So looking forward to that. And then Michael Soul will take up after Clayton, and he'll present on uh, applying continuous. I'm going to do it from memory, which I'm going to get wrong. Continuous. I'm going to use the word delivery with InTune. I don't think it's exactly correct, but looking forward to stuff about InTune and things that are continuous, automation at its best. So with that, I don't think I was sharing. I apologize. So Clayton, can you? Yeah, maybe I am. You want to share your screen, and we'll kick you off.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So your audio is working,
Here we go.
and there we go. All right, I'm going to mute. So if you have any questions, just throw them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can speak to the presenter.
All right, awesome. Thanks a lot, Doug. Appreciate that. Yeah, so I'm actually here to give a little talk about 365 Automated Lab. It's a module I created in the past year, I'd say. And just a little bit about myself first. Been I think it's actually now 17 years. I haven't updated that. Started out as a level one help desk, like many of us. Now I'm a systems admin. But I've been with the company I'm currently at for almost 12 years. And we're about 300 people or so. So you can kind of guess I do a little of everything as well, but more strictly by my title as a systems admin now. Okay. Perfect. So, okay, cool. So purpose of this was creating standards. I'm working Office 365 and doing tests. So in our environment, we couldn't use dynamic groups that much. We had too many one-offs. So I had to figure a way to get a little creative. And with my testing, I got tired of deleting, remember which users I created. So then you kind of like dig through like who was the ones I created. So I had to find some way. I started using CSVs, but then I started getting too many CSV files because they had one for users, groups, teams, SharePoint sites. It just got a little too much, and I knew I had to figure out some way. And luckily, I actually used Doug's Import Excel module and some other things I've done, and I knew it was the perfect fit. Keep it all in one Excel workbook, and just use worksheets for each category. And yes, all these functions are lab environment, but I do use them in production. But please test in your test environment first. But some are actually very useful for in production as well. Okay. So installation and setup. So one thing I will highly recommend if you don't already have it is the developer program. It's free. You just need I'll say real telephone number. Actually try using a Ring Central, a Google phone number, and one other one, and none of them worked. It actually had to be a cell phone number, which I thought was kind of interesting, but I get it because they don't want people just creating accounts to then spam people. So I can see why they made it a little stricter. Some of the requirements for PowerShell v7.1, Import Excel, Exchange Online Management, Microsoft Graph, and PS Framework. And if you haven't used PS Framework before, definitely recommend that as well. I'm only using it for logging, but it's a whole beast of a module. And I've tested this on Windows and Mac OS as well as the M1s as well too. And also a little more on that 365 developer program. It gives you 25 free E5 licenses, except for the OS, if I remember. I think there's one thing it doesn't do, but it gives you basically everything. And some of the key features currently Always trying to think of new ways to expand and implement it. We're adding, removing users, groups, teams, and sites with Excel. Um, Export production data to Excel. So say you have your production environment, then your test 10, you can actually export it out from your production into the correct format to import it into your test environment so that you can have real data, especially if you're testing like conditional access or some other kind of queries that you actually have the same data as in your production environment. Um, and what's it called? I don't have it, so it does it all in one swoop yet, but it's just 2 steps and you're all set. And the best part is you don't even have to have Excel installed. I mean, that's just great. So if you see here, do this, you can actually see this is an Excel sheet. I do not have Excel installed on this. I have no, I don't have Office 365 installed on here, and it actually uses a plugin or extension in VS Code to actually see this.
Hey, Clay, you got a question. How do you like the PS framework and the logging?
Absolutely love it.
Cool. Is that all
Absolutely.
you've been using for?
Yeah, there's so much more I can do with it. I just haven't gotten a chance with it, but it's nice how it actually logs out to the host, but then also you can have it saved to a file as well, depending on um, which message you're using.
Mm-hmm.
And it can show verbose as well too. It's absolutely amazing. I just use that now. I don't use the built-in one anymore. It's just convenient.
Mm-hmm. And Sam has a question. Do
Yep.
you use it to build the module as well?
I've not yet, but that's the next step for other modules to kind of automate that whole part. That's actually how I originally found it, and then so I did the logging as well.
Cool.
Okay. And so core functionalities I'm going to go over today are creating a data environment, the user group management, um, teams management, and SharePoint site management. So now we get to the actual fun part. So this right here, this 365 data environment workbook, I actually have it in the module on GitHub. So that's actually a file in there, so you can actually use this as a test for you to get you started. I actually originally used a ChatGPT to create all these, so I didn't have to kind of get creative. Because who wants to create these, 23 or 22 users um, every time? So that's why I just did it. And these actually are real city states with the correct zip code. Actually, I just changed that since I had to redo this. Um, it will format it back. I just have to change that for it.
So basically, you use ChatGPT to create mock data,
Yep.
and it's as good as that. If you ask it for cities and states, it gets that part correct.
Yep. And same with the phone numbers.
Awesome.
It even does the correct zip code, area code, and
The exchange and then
chain.
whatnot.
Yep.
Awesome.
For that city and state.
Yeah, I can see 212 is definitely New York. Great.
Yep. Yep. I didn't think it went the whole thing, but I might have changed on that
Yeah.
one. But
It's close enough.
yeah. All right, cool. So let's see here. Back here real quick. So to those. Okay, now. So then you can also create a template. So I have a code for here. So this will actually, right here, will create this whole template. So with the users groups, this will actually do IT-Connecticut and then ACT-Florida or FL for these. And then it'll create the teams and the sites. So right here, we'll do this. So then it created that template. Then you can actually fill in your information. So if you really want to give this as an option, then here's the team description, team type, channel name one, going so forth.
Oh, cool. So that's like a git and knit.
Yep,
So you get a nice boilerplate, and then you don't have to worry about figuring those things out. Nice.
exactly. Just trying to make it as simple as possible. Since I know how we're all busy enough, so why make us even more busy? Uh, and this is for SharePoint sites, and this is for the group. So what this is actually for is if you have a user that say they're in IT and in Connecticut, this will pull all their groups, 365 groups, distribution lists, and security groups from here. So you can actually see it from here, give you a little better idea. So here, groups. So you can see right here, and this will know from this type right here, it'll know which command to run to actually add them correctly. Okay, so now we have the template. Then see we have our production data. So right here, this will actually export production users to here. So then here we go. And here we go. So this is technically from, say this would be our production environment, has all the users. Then say you wanted the groups as well too. We have that. And I also do have teams as well. I do not have SharePoint sites yet, but that's on the radar. So you can do this and watch this. Didn't even have to close it out. Right there, added them right on. So now we want to do for users. So this is how easy it is to, we're just going to remove users since we already have users in there right now. So here's the file path for it, your domain for it. Authenticate. And there we go. And I have it so it shows who's being removed too as well, just to make it easier. Awesome. And then to actually create new ones. So say this is where it makes it super easy. So now say we want those people back in there. Just change that to new user or new CT365 user. And then so what this password actually is it sets the password for all those users. At one point I did have them all in the Excel worksheet, but it just got to be a pain of like having them all in there. So I figured just have one for all of them, and then you can adjust after that. So here we go. So create something that's assigned license too. So if it doesn't, so say you go over your 25 licenses, it'll actually fill out saying that it couldn't assign those licenses. It'll still create the user, but not apply a license to them. So then here we have, so this is that we're talking about the adding the users groups by, we'll call it role for this. So New York IT. Yep, perfect. And this will add it to the A. Johnson account. Oops. And right now, this is all interactive. I don't have it through any other way, but I do want to look into more ways of other ways of implementing it, so you don't have to use interactive authentication. Here should go. Yep. And simple as that. And each of these are actually all different commands as well. So that's what made it quite a bit fun figuring this whole thing out.
So when you say that, you mean that those are actual commands in your module, or
Correct.
so you're actually dynamically doing like an eval, so to speak, or
exactly. So I'm having it using I'm trying to, I want to say it's a switch statement, basically saying like if it
Hmm.
sees 365 group, use this one. If it
Hmm.
uses and going forward
Sweet.
with it. That was a little tricky because I didn't want to have it all different functions for it. Just wanted to have one simple function to handle it all for it.
Nice abstraction. Definitely. Next level PowerShell.
Trying.
So it's like, so yeah, so I like the way, of course, I like the way you use Excel. I know the module you used, but the,
Yep.
you're using an Excel workbook as a database where each tab is a table. And
Yep.
it's really cool because you can go in here and you can do find, replace, updates, whatever you want using Excel. Then all your configuration data is ready to go. And then you take it up another level of abstraction by calling the function dynamically, so to speak.
Yep. And one you'll like too as well. I actually did this a little earlier. Um, where is it? So this right here, this set CT365. So the SP stands for SharePoint.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens with SharePoint, even if you delete the account, if you don't fully delete it from the recycle bin, it keeps that number and won't let you create that account again because of the email address will be the same. So what this does is goes in, finds some. So I had 25 was my queue number for it and change it to 27 so
Nice.
that I can quickly just keep on going forward with it instead of having to delete everything out. I've since then created clear out the whole entire recycle bin as well so that you don't need this as much, but in a pinch, it's nice and easy to use that, and hence why all these are 27. So it changes all the numbers right here for
Cool.
so that it'll work correctly.
Cool. So let me, are you close to wrapping up or you want a couple more things?
Just I could just this Teams. I mean, Teams does the same thing, and SharePoint's the same way. It's
Well,
same
so they're all
concept for all.
basically the same concept and you just use this. Oh,
Exactly. It's that simple.
dude, that sounds like the boss comes and says, hey, I need XYZ. You say, yeah, it's going to take a week. And then you do it and head to the beach for a few days. That's what I would do.
Exactly. It makes it so much easier for when you're trying to do test environments as well too. Of
Mm,
just trying to remember who's in there, who's not, and just having that one kind of like boiler template that you know that these people are in it, and you can just add and remove them, depending on the scenario.
nice. So let me ask you a question about the development of this. So how hard was it to debug it once you got to those levels of abstractions? Was there any challenges or was it straightforward?
Definitely were some challenges, and I also had Christian Ritter help me out a little bit in the beginning as well.
Cool.
He gave me some ideas as well,
Hmm.
and then used ChatGPT. Um, it helped. It was amazing of how well it did some of the troubleshooting on it. I was
Really?
definitely impressed with how well it handled it, of or at least giving me that baseline of okay, where to go from now.
Oh,
Like
nice.
it would trigger some things, and then I might get an error, and then I'll kind of look at that error either through ChatGPT or just do a quick search, and then I'd see like some things where I found out like something about the modules not
Hmm.
matching. Um, ChatGPT didn't give me the hint for that,
Hmm.
but then when I searched, some of the did a little googling, I found out on GitHub through some of the solutions, the issues, and then seeing that some of them were actually common errors, like
Nice.
recent ones. So,
So what, when you use when you say you use ChatGPT,
yep.
um, what, did you use the web or did you use Copilot in GitHub in VS Code or what?
So I use more of the web part, but I was using PowerShell AI before for
Mhm.
some of it. Um, but yeah, I'm mostly I'll say nothing against Ramaj. It's using ChatGPT is just kind of easier. It's easier to want to
Mhm.
jump from machine to machine as well
Definitely. Yeah.
too.
Oh, that's a good
Um,
point.
I have since I use multiple machines somewhat often with doing this, so it just kind of more just convenient.
Mhm.
But yeah, but both have been super helpful. And I have not actually used GitHub Copilot yet. I've been wanting to try that out.
Plus, they all cost money, so it's like, okay, so what do I want? By the time you're done, you could end up spending like $1,000 on different GPTs
Right.
across the world to see what happens, and it's crazy. So
I
Sam
will.
make. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say the $20 for ChatGPT Plus, well worth it. Like I pay that out of my own pocket.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like it's not worth paying for. It's me paying for it, and I keep it's what's $20? Like it's like not even an hour of time
I
a month.
totally agree with you. I'm 100% behind that. $20 a month. That's 4 Starbucks coffees. I think you
Right.
can't afford not to have it with what
Exactly.
just somebody just recently said, ChatGPT is for learning, Google is for links, and Perplexity, which is another AI, which is free, is all about reference. And Sam brings up a point. A polyglot notebook could be interesting layer to interact with this project in.
That's actually one of the things I was looking at as well too. I don't know Polyglot notebooks enough dealing with the local side of it for the files. Um, but that's actually what I wanted to use for training too, for other
Mm-hmm.
technicians and stuff that they could use it.
Exactly. Well, you kind of do know notebooks because if you have a file inside of VS Code, that's
Yep,
basically a cell inside of the notebook, and it works. It's just like if you're typing at the command line in each
gotcha.
cell, and yeah, and it's worthwhile investing in that as well. Somebody asked for what's the GitHub link for this. Oh, Sam, you got it. Sam, thank you. He's all
Thanks,
over it.
Sam.
What's Bing Chat for? Bing Chat's for people who don't want to pay for Chat GPT Plus,
Yep,
and it's always going to be at least a few months behind. It's
right.
top notch. I don't do. I would. It
I've used
is
it.
OpenAI. Go ahead.
I'll say I've actually that's actually how I created my um the actual logo for this module. So this right here, this right
No way.
here.
You're. This is AI driven.
Yep. There's not
Nice.
one that was all from I did not touch it up or anything. That's just how it came out.
Awesome. Yeah. So depending on your budget, yeah, use Edge with or Bing Chat's fine, or use Google's new stuff that's popping out, and the LLMs and the GPTs are fundamentally the same. UX is going to be the special sauce, right?
Right.
So if you got Copilot, it's tuned differently than ChatGPT Web, but ChatGPT Web has all the latest stuff from OpenAI. So it has nothing to do with the AI underneath. They're all going to be basically the same. They're going to be commoditized at
Right.
some point.
And one thing I
Solid
wanted to
logo. Go ahead.
I was say one thing I just wanted to add is that I actually wanted to try to do a custom GPT for Microsoft Graph.
Ah,
Because then
dude,
they'll help out with this as well too.
that's absolute. That's the right thinking. So would love to see your prompts, Sam says.
No
Hey, you
problem,
know what?
Sam.
Maybe we can do a whole PowerShell PowerShell pulse where everybody shares their prompts and their
It's a good idea.
techniques. I like it. I think yep. So if you want to, I'm going to put out a sessionize for that. So if folks want to join and we can talk about it, it'd be great. Alan puts out a couple of useful things in the same vein. Introduction to excellent links, Microsoft 365 DSC, automated lab, automation from users for users. Awesome.
Yep.
And I always like to be annoying. And I say when somebody brings up DSC, I go, that's still a thing. But
There's
yeah, I know a lot
DSC3
of
now.
yeah, people are using it. They're building it and whatever. Cool. Anything else you want to add? You want to add how people can get in touch with you, or you want to?
Yeah. So here's linked for it. I'll even put up on my GitHub too if you guys want the quick PowerPoint for it. But this is how to find me. My GitHub is DevClate. Socials, I'm either Clayton T or DevClate.
Sweet.
Um, feel free to reach out or LinkedIn as well too. Um, the blog's Clayton T. Um, but yeah, and feel free to reach out. Love to talk. Doesn't have to be this mod anything PowerShell, IT tech, home automation. I'm here.
Awesome. And I'll post that in the meetup and as well as on the YouTube. And Alan says, yep, DSC is still alive and kicking. Yeah, okay. That sounds good. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Is there any other questions?
thanks for that. Anybody else want to? Very cool. Clem, welcome. Clem says, yeah, excellent. So terrific. So let's thanks for being the first speaker at the first PowerShell what did I call this thing?
Pulse.
Pulse.
Yep.
At the first I don't know what I'm talking about. I only had my fourth coffee. I need a fifth.
I was gonna say
Um
fourth beer.
some point, hopefully.
Right.
That's Drew says, thanks for the presentation. Loved it. Awesome. So cool. So Michael Saul, he's been
Awesome.
on before. He speaks at conferences and he's a national director at Sentinel Technology. So welcome, Michael. If you want to share your
Yeah,
screen, how are you?
doing good, Doug, and thanks for having me on. It was awesome to see what Clayton was working on, and you get an A. You hit it pretty much exactly with the title earlier, so no hesitation. Your memory's solid.
Did I? I just looked at it like for three. I was like, oh man, I forgot to. Anyway, awesome. Thank you.
Awesome.
Um,
So this is something that builds on even what we just saw. Taking a little different perspective to it. You've seen my talks before, Doug, where I enjoy blurring the lines of what PowerShell can do with other tooling. So one of the concepts here we're going to kick right into this demo is we've got this build environment where we've got an InTune tenant. And so let's just say I'm going about my day as an admin. I come in and I'm going to be like, hey, let's make a new compliance policy. We'll just call it PowerShell Pulse. And we'll just put a timestamp in here. Nothing crazy. Let's just say we'll require BitLocker on this policy. All good. All right, so I got my new policy. We got my timestamp in there. This is in my dev environment. And now what we're going to do is be patient. Normally, we just keep going about our day. Nothing too crazy here. But in the background, what's actually happening now is just by the fact that I made a change in our build tenant, that configuration triggered an event. And so now any events that are being changed, I could come back in here and let's just say, hey, let's go back into a different compliance policy. Let's just change the timestamp on that a little bit. Let's do 2024 0208. And let's just say I'm Mountain Time too. So if y'all are on Eastern, that's why my timestamps look a little funky. But so I just made a second change. All of these changes start to get queued up. And as we see those outcomes actually occur, we're going to trigger something called InTune CD, InTune as code. And we want to use that to be able to actually capture all of those changes. And don't worry, Sam, we'll get into exactly what's triggering it, how it's recorded, how it's exposed in a second. Um, I'm buying some time because this does happen in the background, and sometimes Azure Intune can be a little slow. So why are we doing this? Why are we trying to get all this info into GitHub? So backups, documentation, change management. These are things that in a cloud environment, we run into a lot where we sort of forgot about them. We've spent Most of us have probably spent dozens, if not hundreds of hours making configuration changes in O365 tenants, in any of these cloud SaaS platforms. And those may not be very well documented. They may not be in a state where we could say, hey, if that vendor accidentally lost those changes, we could restore them. And so, not only that, if we're making these changes, how are we documenting them and making sure that going forward, our broader team is informed about them? So, that's why we're doing all these steps. And so, what we'll show now is, let me make sure this actually ran. Essentially, as these changes have been happening, we are waiting to see in GitHub our documentation and our branch get updated. And so what InTune CD does is it pulls that configuration state and it will actually create markdown documentation for us as well. And so if we go in here, we can go back into our compliance policies and see that we did have some compliance policies in the past. And what we'll see is this document actually gets updated with the current build state as soon as it triggers. And while we're waiting for that, I'll just bring over and start talking through how this is actually happening since it's being a little slow. So when we made the change in our build environment, all of our changes get logged to our audit log. So if you're unfamiliar with the audit logs, if you're actually changing the environment in any way, if you're just reading, you won't see an audit log. But if you're actually changing things, those changes will get logged in as an audit event. With diagnostic settings, we can actually configure different outputs for all of those events. And so what we're doing here is we're saying for any of our audit logs, we want to stream these to an event hub. And in Azure, an event hub gives us the ability to actually act on those. So as an event comes in, it gets streamed. Once that event is in queue, we can do some action to process it. And so what we're seeing right now is sometimes it takes a little bit of time for these events to actually get synced up. So one of my favorite jokes, the cloud's eventual consistency. So we just saw that, and it took about 5 minutes from when we made a change to even have that event get streamed into our event hub. But now what that's doing is it's kicking off some additional processes, and ultimately what we'll see here in a minute is those will end up pushing into our GitHub.
So before you move on to that, Alan had a question. Do you have the rep link for InTune CD?
Yes, it is on GitHub, and I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but he puts out some good content, and it's just one of the different projects out there that do things like this, like Alan shared about M365 DSC, and there's a few others. Like even you could do this with what Clayton was just showing. So there's definitely options. This is just one example. This one is built in Python. So we are sort of blurring the lines between PowerShell and other languages here, but definitely it's just a possibility. And so one of the things that we're looking for is we also want the separation so that our production environment, in this instance, if we're using continuous delivery, we technically don't ever have to have our administrators log into a production environment. So if we flip back to why, there's also a security benefit that's not listed here too. If our admins only have to log in to a production environment, if there's like an outage or in a break glass scenario, we're separating even them from potentially causing negative impacts or being phished or being socially engineered. And so we're getting the separation where even our changes are done in a way where an admin isn't ultimately the individual making those changes. And then Event Hub and the webhook. Yep. And so there is cost to that with Azure. It's very minimal, but we'll definitely go through that and you can see how much it actually costs here in a few slides. And so we should see this update in a second. Just pulling back over to our GitHub here. And we'll flip into our build branch. And so our build branch is 2 commits ahead of main. I still don't think this is pushed. Yeah, all the timestamps look a little outdated still. The notable thing here, though, is all of this is happening behind the scenes. So when you made those changes, you don't have to go in and trigger a backup job. You don't have to go in and trigger any sort of additional documentation creation. All of that's actually happening just by the fact that you made that change. And so that's the important piece is don't add another thing to your plate that you have to be responsible for. Try and simplify what that looks like. And can GitHub deploy your changes? Yep, 100%. So that's what we'll show too, is this will actually pull down this build backup, and then we'll be using, in this instance, a GitHub action to end up pushing this into the prod tenant. So that's spot on. Whether you consider that GitOps, continuous delivery, however you sort of define that, there's definitely different concepts and methodologies and approaches to that. All right.
Nice broad range of automation.
Yeah, definitely a few things happening. Oh, and so they were in there. It just didn't prompt me to create the pull request on the main page. But so all I did was go into the commits that we were ahead of main on. And so basically in the background, InTune CD pulled all our configuration backups. We now have this exact breakdown of everything that changed in the environment. So we can see we added something new. It ends up being we added that new compliance policy. We can see that the description changed on one of our descriptions there. And then also it's adding in all of the settings. So we can see BitLocker enabled is true. And all of this documentation was generated just by the fact that we actually did our job in our build tenant. And so if we do a pull request now, in our pull request, those commits get rolled up. The other aspect too is we're able to take the context of, hey, this was a successful operation. It was done by this person and it was in the portal. And so we're actually able to pull all of that context into our change log. So now if you do have an internal change process where that had to go for approval, you needed your change committee to review and approve that, that would have all been staged and ready to go before you even had to go to that meeting. And so if we hop in, I mentioned there's a GitHub automation in the back end. So now, since we created that pull request, it's actually merging those changes into our production environment. So if we pull up our prod environment, you can see if we look in here, there's no PowerShell Plus or PowerShell Pulse policy. And if we go into this older policy, you can see it's still a 2023 date in the description. We'll give this GitHub automation a second to run. You can see all the major steps here. This is actually using PowerShell as well. And then we'll dive into exactly what these different steps are doing here in a minute. But another nice part about this, all of these are being used as service principles. So there's definitely some possibility here to improve these. I'll get to those caveats in a second, but a lot of these aren't static credentials. A lot of these aren't things that you'll have to go rotate or be worried about getting leaked.
Did you handcraft the GitHub action?
I did. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
It was a bit painful.
Yep.
Especially if you want to use PowerShell. Yep. Yeah. So the PowerShell and GitHub actions isn't something that I'd say many people are doing, but it's definitely possible. And there's some people out there who use it for like automating their builds on their PowerShell modules and such. So it's super useful. I think, Doug, you may even be doing a little bit of that, aren't you?
Yeah, I do that as well as I do all my testing across a matrix of operating systems. So I can make sure that import Excel works on everything. They're very useful, but yeah, it's can be tricky and a bit brittle sometimes.
Another good concept here we've been talking through is this separation. So GitOps allows you to have this separation where the admin actually doesn't have to go into prod and make changes. So this means you can have different tiers of accounts. So these can be different admin accounts entirely. And you can have different security constraints. So especially if you have people who are like, oh, it's really hard to be able to do my day job because I'm having to PIM up every hour and get my peer to approve my PIM request every hour. If you're doing privileged identity management in Entra, you may be able to lessen those security constraints in your build environment because you've already got other security controls in place to even approve maybe that pull request. And then additional security constraints if anyone wanted to do anything in production. So that's something to keep in mind too, is even talking about AI's developer or user experience. What is your admin's user experience? What is that day-to-day look like? So you aren't making a whole lot more friction of somebody's day job. And this is almost done. You can see it's also taking backups. So, hey, we're about to change production. Let's get a backup of production before we make any of those changes. Other considerations too. This project doesn't show it, but if you get really into the GitOps model and approach, you can certainly start to do things where you can have rollbacks built in. You could have an action where, hey, if that change didn't go as planned, you could immediately roll back. Things of that nature. GitOps gives you a lot more flexibility. And if you build those in, like if you're doing all of your change management through ServiceNow or an ITSM platform, there's a lot more possibility where you can say, hey, if there's 100 cases that get opened and they're all correlated to this change, we're just immediately going to roll back that change. Things like that.
Have you experimented using this approach to do like canary deploys and stuff like that?
A little bit. It that gets really hard with endpoints, just because you want to push the change, and then you're waiting for InTune to actually apply the change. You certainly can. InTune has the concept of rings for like updates with Windows updates for business and stuff. So that's something I encourage, is like have ring deployments for your changes. And that way you do that sort of A/B green blue testing with any changes even to your endpoints.
Yeah, a lot of the Wall Street firms, they all have, they've used rings for decades. It's for Linux. So it makes sense, and it definitely, it's the mindset of canary deploys and all that good stuff, but you have to architect it and you have to figure it out. So it's a challenge.
Yeah. It takes time. So you can see now our build has merged into our prod, or our main branch, because the GitHub action succeeded. So that pull request was automatically merged and closed. It's no longer open. And essentially at this point, if we go back into our production, we'll actually see these changes in production as well. But we've already gotten our prod as built documentation. So you can see this was updated. And if we go down to our compliance policies, you can see we actually have PowerShell Pulse in there. And so our documentation's already updated. We go back into our production tenant and we do a refresh. We've got our new policy added. And if we look for the settings, we can see, hey, that is the timestamp. We've got BitLocker required. And all we had to do was our normal day-to-day operations in the InTune admin console. So what all happened? There were good questions. What's happening? Talk through this a little bit. I'll run through that again. This is where it gets a little funky. I know, Doug, you've talked about Mermaid a fair bit. These are Mermaid diagrams.
I was just looking at that diagram and I said, I bet you use Mermaid.
Yeah.
Cool.
I use it for always, like, if I've got any sort of sequential process or any sort of dependency mappings, that's just become my go-to of like, even if I'm working through a project, I lay it out in Mermaid and I'm like, sweet. Oh, I did that piece. I didn't do that piece.
Sweet. That's awesome. Well, so now that we're going to go on a Mermaid deep rabbit hole, just quick. So what do you use to render? Is this a GitHub render?
No. So I actually use Mermaid Live. So just the website. Yep.
You use your live website and then you drop it in and you're good to go. Sweet.
Exactly. Yep. So, and
cool.
Definitely there's other options, but that's the easiest one that I've worked with.
The syntax has to get used to, but it does some really cool things. And then the best part is that you can actually take this, put it in your Markdown. And then if you check it into GitHub, your Markdown, GitHub will render your Markdown with the Mermaid syntax as this diagram. So there's a lot of options, but there are other tools. Good stuff. Yep.
So we talked through the audit log gets streamed to an event hub through our diagnostic settings on our audit log. We saw these messages come in. What happened is these messages actually triggered a function. And so in Azure, you can have Azure Functions. Azure Functions actually can just be anything that you want. In this case, it is a PowerShell script. And this PowerShell script's basically saying, hey, Event Hub came in, process this message. So every time a message comes in, we're going to want to, I'll pull up the integration so you can see it here. Anytime a message comes in, trigger this function and run this block of code. And in this instance, it's a really small subset of code. I should be able to pull it up here. Yeah. So this is just my search sort of shorthand. There's a few pieces in here, but ultimately our function is this simple. So we've got a couple parameters. We've got our message coming in and the trigger. We write a couple event log or host messages just so we know what's happening. And then for each message, we're just saying grab the record if it was a successful change. So basically, we're not triggering any changes via InTune CD if there was a failure or it didn't result in a successful change. And so successful operation occurred. This is what I was saying too. We've got that context from the event log so we can say, hey, this is who made that change. We're doing also two outputs. So we're pushing our commit message. So this is what builds our commit message into a storage queue. And that's just another way for us to process bulk changes and bundle them into one push through GitHub. But we're also doing this invoke AZ REST method. This is one of the services that hasn't gotten a ton of PowerShell love, so there's still a gap here on a native commandlet. But if you're not familiar with it, you can just pull the REST endpoints that get called, and you can actually call them yourself. So what this is doing is going into an Azure app container job, and it's starting that app container job for us. So that's all we're doing is we're saying, hey, push this commit message. There's no easy way to merge this. So anytime a storage queue gets added to, you can trigger that. So we just do it two outputs during that process. And you can see here the event message is the trigger for the function with the output on the storage queue, but it can't model that we're also calling that REST API. A couple questions though. What happens if a pull request ends up being denied? So if it ends up being denied, it just doesn't end up in production. So you do have a state difference between your build and your production environment. Like I was saying, with GitOps, could you build a rollback process and revert your build environment to the current production build? 100%. You could have that as an additional GitHub action that triggers as soon as that pull request is canceled or blocked. You can immediately say, hey, push our production build or our production configuration into our build tenant because we don't want people trying to make new changes off of a bad config. That's not out there right now, but definitely possible. Retries. So if you're talking about retries on the console, so if it didn't end up in the audit log, we aren't going to take any action on it. If we are changing something multiple times, those all get appended to the same pull request. So another scenario you'd want to think through a lot, like Doug was saying, you have to architect what you want those situations to look like. If somebody makes one change and then 20 other people make changes, do you want to bundle those all as one pull request? Do you need those to be independent pull requests? What is sort of the approach your organization wants to take? Because 100% that can get into race conditions where like, I want to approve that commit, but not these 20 other commits. And you get really messy really quick. and then do the logs or change events get recorded within your telemetry, monitoring, or SIM, where someone in the SOC perhaps see trending and correlate. So definitely that's a possibility. Right now, that's not in here. There are ways to pull that, so you would be able to see those commit messages. You would be able to see the audit log events. You would be able to see any of the activity events for the other Azure resources. So you'd see the function processing the Event Hub message. You would see the container app job pulling and cleaning the storage queue item or message. You would see all of that detail, but 100% you could, in the PowerShell function, the code itself, write additional telemetry, write better log messaging. This wasn't an observability first project, so it is lacking in the observability into exactly what's happening where, when. And that's why you saw me sort of buy time to just ramble while it was processing and being a little slow there.
That's cool. I like the way you use observability first, because my new mantra is AI first, but it's all good.
Yep. And so you can see here too, so container app jobs, if you're unfamiliar with those, if you build a Docker image, basically this is Microsoft Azure's competitor to AWS's Fargate. So if you just want to have a container that's run on a certain criteria, you can create a container app job, you point it at your Docker image, and you just say, hey, when this happens, run it. And so that's what we were doing. We were using the REST API to trigger that just manually in our Azure function. And that's also why mermaid diagrams help, because this all gets really complex really quick. So to visualize that, we had our diagnostic log create that message in our event hub. That triggered our function, which our function creates that queue message and pushes it into a storage account queue. Then we have our container app job read from that storage account queue, actually push that commit message into our build branch. You'll also see here our container app job is using a key vault secret. So I'll dive into that a little bit here too. And so if you're unfamiliar with Docker, this is a Docker file, and this is the commands that Docker would run to build that actual container image that you'd store in your repository. So all we're doing is saying, hey, from this image, update, do all of our normal Linux housekeeping, install our Git binaries so we can use those. Right here, we're just saying, hey, these are the steps to get PowerShell installed. We want to be able to use PowerShell. It's a little bit more comfortable, a little easier. And then InTune CD is Python, as I mentioned. So we're also installing and bootstrapping pip so that we can install InTune CD. Once we're there, we're installing our Azure modules, and we're then running this PowerShell script. In this PowerShell script, all we're doing is creating a JSON file that allows InTune CD to act as a service principal. So one of the callouts that I wanted to make, don't do this. Because I am in this image actually building this key, this secret material from our key vault into this JSON file, this will stick in that image. So this would not be an image you would push to a public repository, because your service principal secret would be in there. So demos, proof of concepts and all, I did it the bad way. So I'm letting you know, don't do this. It's a workaround. As long as you don't make your image public, that secret is still safe. But keep in mind, this Docker image that it would compile or build would ultimately have secret material in it. So you would need to protect that. But also what we're doing, we're getting our GitHub private key. So we're writing that. So instead of having to save our GitHub SSH key on the image, we're also writing that out from Key Vault, just so that we don't have to commit our secrets into any sort of source control. We're actually pulling our secrets, and if they change in the future through a key vault automation, anytime we rebuild this Docker image, it's going to pull the correct secret for each of our use cases. Just keep in mind, those secrets will exist in that Docker image, so treat that as a secret itself. All right, enough of my caveats. And then the last step we do is we're essentially running a shell script. This one's got a few steps. We're essentially just configuring Git. We're creating our branches, pulling down our current build, and then we're setting it to do SSH. Once we've got our current main branch, we're going to check out and make a new build branch. We're going to make sure we're pulling any changes, so if there is anything queued, we're building on it. Then we tell InTune CD to create our backup of our build environment, and then create documentation of our build environment from what it just pulled down. All of these documents it created, we add into our Git commit. And then this is an encoded PowerShell command that gives us a little bit extra. Let me see if I've got that one too. Yeah, here we go. And so this one, this is where we're actually pulling from our storage account. So this is where we get our commit messages from. So we're just timing out these messages. So if for any reason we don't delete this queue message from our storage account before the timer elapses, we're going to put it back in. We get context on the storage account. We don't have to use a credential because we're already authenticated as the container app job service principal. We get all the messages from the queue, and then for these messages, we try and process them. Those commits get pushed into a text file, and that's what builds out ultimately what we're going to push in the commit message for GitHub. All this gets converted into an encoded command, and if we go back here to the shell, that's what you see here. And so this is a good example of how we get really complex here with nesting. We've got our Docker file, which builds into an image, which runs a PowerShell script, but then at runtime of that Docker image, we're actually running a shell script too. So good practice, this set InTune CD JSON PS1 would actually happen at runtime from our shell script. That way your secret material wouldn't get saved in a layer of your Docker image. We push all those commits into our commit message, and then we push all those changes into our upstream. And that, at this point, gets us to our build branch. Then what you saw, our build branch was updated. GitHub automatically said, hey, you want to do a pull request for all these commits? And once you trigger that pull request, that's where our action hops in. And our action has to talk to our production InTune tenant, update our main branch, both before it makes the changes, it takes a backup of our production tenant, and then after. It's going to create a pre and post configuration change. The other thing too is in our action, we're actually using PowerShell so that the action authenticates as a service principal to our Entra tenant. This is another example of one of those where you'd change this a little bit in a production environment. You would not want your production secrets stored in your build environment. So this is just me being a little lazy for a proof of concept, but you'd ultimately have your production secrets in your production tenant and your build secrets in your build tenant and keep those separate. And ultimately, if we look at that action, so when we do trigger our GitHub workflow, working through this, you can see we're doing a backup of our production environment. First, we're actually installing everything, checking out our repositories, similar cleanup to what you saw in that PowerShell script and that shell script. But here we're basically saying we're going to create a new file using Azure login. This is how we're logging in with our service principal. So this all gets configured as a trust relationship in GitHub, and then your Entra tenant as that service principal. once we're logged in as that service principal, there's no secret material needed, but we do pull down our secret at runtime for our production environment so that we can push these changes. We use that JSON file with the secret material to take our pre-change production backup using InTune CD. We stage all of those changes to the documentation. And then we also push that config from the build to the prod. And at that point, we do one more documentation run. We bundle up all those changes, and that's where we push all those changes into the main branch. So a lot going on, but at the high level, that's the process. Any questions, or anybody want to talk through any more of these process pieces before I get into just some additional caveats and thoughts?
Wow, I think the only thing I didn't see there was Ruby, Go, and Rust.
Yeah, no PowerShell AI either. I
Yeah,
tried to
well,
work that one in, but
I think if I handed all this over to AI and said, "Please explain," it would tell me, "Yeah, I'm not going to try." That's a lot of different boundaries, man. I mean, GitHub Actions, Docker containers, Azure functions, um, Bash scripts. It's amazing. That's awesome. Crazy, I think, but necessary.
yep. And it's what we see often is, especially with these SaaS applications,
Mm.
a lot of the complexity isn't in the day-to-day maintaining of the SaaS applications. It's any integrations you want to do beyond that SaaS platform.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Sam's head exploded. That's mine exploded. I was like, that's a so how do you anyway, we actually something I would talk with you offline is like even just managing this in terms of like debugging it. It's like you could have a bad secret, you could have, I mean, obviously it's like anything. That's just a lot of stuff to pretend. I mean, it has to be done, right? But it's a lot of pieces to keep track of.
100%. Yeah.
Wow.
And that's where, like I said, this is a good example of what's possible. Doing this in a production environment, you would have things like observability that Clem was mentioning. You'd have additional processes that sort of govern, hey, how do we do secret management? How do we do pull requests? How do we do GitOps? Like, we're talking about 30 potential different processes in an organization to make one thing work.
Gotcha. And then there's not even Kubernetes with microservices.
Yeah, we didn't have to manage our Kubernetes cluster. Thankfully, we said, Microsoft, you're good enough to do that. Here's my Docker image and just run it wherever you want to.
So where do you put where do you host your Docker images? All in Azure in your own space, or do you put it elsewhere? Or
Yeah, so this image is hosted in an Azure container repo.
Gotcha.
So nothing too special there.
And then you can actually take that at some point, bring it down, test it if you want, or pass it around if it makes sense, or architect for that possibility.
Exactly. Yep. And just because this one has the secret materials built into a layer, I didn't want to publish the Docker image to any public repo, but the Docker file's out there, so you could certainly rebuild it. You would just have to have secrets in the right places with the right names.
Yep. Interesting. So Clem made the comment, mermaid or some sort of flow diagram, definitely a must, but very interesting to see. Yeah, it'd be interesting to be, you really probably couldn't reverse engineer this to actually generate a mermaid diagram. But yeah, you need some overarching type of documents that show you the flow of this kind of stuff.
Yep.
Cool. Good
Yeah,
stuff.
and I know there was a question too, just about costs. So yeah, Azure is consumption. Azure can be scary. A third of all this spend for this solution is just the build VM that I actually ended up building the Docker image off of. I forgot to turn that off this year. So you could turn that off, and then this has been running in the background for $20. So we're a month into the year. Not a huge cost concern, but definitely not something you'd want to necessarily have on your personal credit card, but from a business perspective, few $100 a year to be able to have InTune backups and state management can be definitely worthwhile.
We always hear those stories. When I was at Morgan Stanley, it was all we had it. We used AWS and we were hybriding into Azure, and then you'd always hear the $100,000 monthly bill because somebody changed a logging, something that logs even more. So all good.
Yeah. So just a couple other things, housekeeping wise. As I mentioned, here's the main components of this. So you've got your Azure function that's using a system assigned managed identity. So actually no secret, it's logging into Azure by itself. So to do all the functions, the event hub, the storage queue, the container app job, it's automatically authenticated using your Entra context. The GitHub action is using InTune CD. That has two different authentication criteria. So you're authenticating against your build Entra user assigned managed identity. So that's the key vault secret. This is the one where I was saying separate that into your production key vault storage, not your build key vault storage. And then the app registration is a graph API to the prod environment. And that's what the GitHub action is logging into the prod environment so that it can actually make those graph API calls for InTune CD. The Azure Virtual Machine, this is in the build environment. That's using a system managed identity, and that identity is just there. So when you create your Docker image, you can push it to your Azure Container repo and do all your testing access. Your Azure Container App job, that's another system managed identity, and that's, again, using that build managed identity, but this is where, again, you'd want to separate that secret, this key vault secret, into a runtime pull, so it's not baked into your Docker layers. And then the Entra app registration so that InTune CD can talk to the build environment is used there too. So a few components all working together to make a nice concert of, hey, I made a change and in the background, my backups happened, my documentation happened, and I've got a change request. A few other things that are helpful. I always just, anytime Graph API comes up, it's a bit of a challenging topic. So always use system managed identities. You can use them with Azure VMs or Azure Arc enabled instances. So one less thing, you don't have to log in. You don't have to use an interactive login. You literally just set up the managed identity and you can log into any of the Azure commandlets or the Graph API commandlets as that computer. And so what we've seen is like in build environments, to access the build environment, yeah, maybe you're using PIM or Bastion or PAM solutions to access a VM interactively. But once you're on that VM, why should I have to make you authenticate again to another service? You're already trusted. So assign me a VM as an individual, and that's my build environment VM. So any actions taken by that VM are me taking them. So things like that can make your admin experience a little easier, a little less headache. Directory access as user, this is a good one. Just if you're troubleshooting graph permissions, tenant boundaries, we talked through this a fair bit. Audit logs, super helpful. Merrill from Microsoft does have some really good information on graph. If you're ever lost on like how to interact with the graph API, you can actually do a browser dev tools. You can do your network monitoring, run through in the Azure portal or in the O365 portal what you actually want to happen. And then if you look for your cross-site requests, then you can copy those out as PowerShell. And then you can see exactly the endpoints and what type of session material it's using. Other notes, a lot of InTune features are in the beta API endpoints. So those are very on demand, very limited. So like Win32 app management, if you want to upload app material, all of that's under the beta endpoint. And there's varying support with that with InTune CD and other projects. And then a few other projects, M365 DSC was already talked about. InTune CD is the core library shown here. You can get InTune baselines. So keeping in mind, like now, if all of my configuration is code, I can start to share what my benchmarks are. What are the controls I apply to my endpoints? Microsoft has some good guidance for privileged admin workstations. InTune management's another example of using the graph with a more as code process. And the interesting part here is this is a good GUI example. And yeah, to Alan's point, there is, to Tobias's point, there is a UI even for InTune CD. So if you want more of a web portal to work with InTune CD, you can do that too. And this is another project too for package management. So app packaging is always a headache for endpoints and good to keep in mind. And then that's who I am. That's how you can reach me. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. But that's pretty much what I talk about. So always happy to have conversations on any of this and always happy to answer questions here and there. And then, yep, Alan, these slides will definitely be up on the GitHub, and I will post a link to that GitHub right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. And I'll post those to the meetup chat, as well as I'll put them on the YouTube when you get those to me. Well, I think that about wraps it up. Any other questions for either speaker? I want to say thank you to Clayton and to Michael for taking the time to build their presentations and spend time with us to demo this. Really cool stuff. Not only to get your job done, but to give you some ideas about how you can go about automating your environments, or give you ideas of how to automate things that you didn't see. I think this is great. Tremendous. So we'll wrap that up. And if tomorrow is just as another note, if you want to get on my meetup, you can RSVP. And if you want to learn a bit more about ChatGPT and AI with PowerShell in the console, and how to do things like talk to your documents, definitely come along. Just as a preview, I'm going to actually show how you can upload 5 CSV files that are the concept of 5 different tables. And then I'm going to ask GPT to actually figure out certain things, like which customer bought most in what month. And GPT will actually figure out the different calls into it to do the joins, whatnot, and produce the right answers. At least that's what it did yesterday. So if you want to join in, check out how you, and I'm going to show you in like 10 lines how to build your own AI chat piece that can actually do that. So anyway, anything else? Clayton, Michael, we're good?
All good.
Excellent.
All good.
All right.
Thank
you. Really, really, I appreciate it as well. So also one last note is, if anybody wants to cut their teeth, you're welcome, Alan. So if anybody wants to do presentations, keep an eye on my socials and I'll be announcing it. And you can do as short as 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half hour, hour. Love to hear what you're doing, what you're finding out. It could be a project that you're working on, things that you found out, full-fledged systems if you'd like. So yeah, let me know, and we'll do some more of these. All right, folks, till next time.